Well, our U.S. correspondent Simon Marks is live for us in Washington, D.C., joins us. Good to have you, Simon. After last week's meeting with Vladimir Putin and, of course, coming out saying the honors are on Zelenskyy to come to the table with a peace deal, how has President Donald Trump acted in that Oval Office talks?
Well, in the Oval Office talks with Volodymyr Zelenskyy, Donald Trump was on his best behavior, certainly when contrasted with their February meeting at the White House, the last time Volodymyr Zelenskyy stepped into the Oval Office, which of course became a very combative, made-for-TV affair. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, I think, was impatient, along with members of his delegation, to get into the closed-door discussions with President Trump, and yet still had to endure, I think it was 28 minutes of an impromptu made-for-TV press conference today, but Donald Trump was holding himself back. At one point, for example, a reporter asked whether which side Donald Trump believes is currently holding the cards in the Ukraine conflict. Remember, back in February, he angrily turned on Zelenskyy and said, "You don't have the cards to win this war." Well, the President of the United States wouldn't go there. He said, "I don't want to talk about that here today. I'm not willing to say." So he was, I think, definitely cautious and determined to try and keep the conversation on a positive trajectory. However, once the circle was expanded to include all of the European leaders who have travelled here essentially to protect Zelenskyy and to prove that they have got his back and they are entirely supportive of him, fissures began to emerge between President Trump and some of the Europeans. The German Chancellor Friedrich Merz was outspoken in dismissing out of hand President Trump's suggestion that you can get to a full peace agreement, a full peace negotiation without a ceasefire. And Chancellor Merz said if there is going to be a three-way conversation that includes Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the United States President, and Vladimir Putin, there has to be a ceasefire in place, he seemed to be suggesting, in order for that to occur. President Trump, since meeting Putin on Friday, has walked away from the whole idea of a ceasefire, and again today said there doesn't need to be one, we can just negotiate the peace while the war is being fought. Also, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, pushed back on the idea of a three-way meeting, Trump, Putin and Zelenskyy. He said it was very important for there to be a quadrilateral meeting. In other words, he wants a seat around the table for the Europeans, something that Donald Trump also rejects, and that is reflective of European anxiety that the President of the United States is altogether too beguiled by the Russian President Vladimir Putin to be an entirely honest broker in all of this. So there's a long way to go here still today, and there were definite indications of disagreement when the European leaders joined the conversation.
All parties have different goals. Ukraine has its interests, wanting to protect its sovereignty, maintain survival. You've got Europe, who agrees on that, but also need to defuse the biggest threat to its security. You've got Putin, who wants to destroy Ukraine's hope of joining NATO. What does Donald Trump want out of this?
Well, Donald Trump indicated on social media that he had absolutely drifted almost entirely into Vladimir Putin's orbit in the hours since the collapse of that Friday summit in Alaska. You know, when that Friday meeting wrapped up, even the White House was conceding it had not worked the way that they wanted it to work. But over the weekend, Donald Trump clearly engaged in a rethink, and by Sunday night on social media, he was echoing Vladimir Putin's insistence that Crimea, for example, can never return to Ukrainian sovereignty, that NATO membership is off the table, a complete non-starter for Ukraine. He was privately reportedly to be suggesting that he favoured Vladimir Putin's call for the entire Donbass region in the east of Ukraine to be handed over to Russia, something that the Europeans and the Ukrainians implacably oppose. So what the European leaders down there at the White House are trying to do right now is drag Donald Trump back in the direction of Volodymyr Zelenskyy and away from the orbit of Vladimir Putin that appears currently to have grabbed him. And when we watched just within the last hour or so, the cameras, Donald Trump talking, and the European leaders all being given a chance to talk, I mean, one got the sense that this was going to be an 8-on-1 session. Zelenskyy and his 7 European protectors, I think really, frankly, ganging up on President Trump and trying to persuade him to focus on Ukraine's interests and not view it as the aggressor in the conflict, which is something that he's done in the past. I think it's going to be very tough talks there today.
We're told that there is a possibility that the European leaders will come back to the Oval Office after these talks. It seems they've been given that invitation. Is that an indication that those talks are going well? And what would be the signal that we need to look for? I mean, if a resolution, for example, on security guarantees is reached today, is that a good signal?
Yeah, just on the choreography. So the Zelenskyy meeting started in the Oval Office. Then Trump and Zelenskyy went to the East Room of the White House. That's the huge room that every president uses for their press conferences. And because there are so many European leaders there and their entourages, they couldn't all be accommodated for really detailed talks in the Oval Office. So those talks are ongoing. And then President Trump indicated he was going to take the European leaders, I think just the 7 leaders themselves, and President Zelenskyy, back into the Oval Office for one final round. Whether that indicates things are going well or Donald Trump's going to invite the media in once again and put everybody through another one of these made-for-TV impromptu press conferences, I think is hard to know. As to where all this goes from here, security guarantees, Tubbo, as you indicated, are absolutely critical in all of this. And there were voices around the table, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, normally a sort of a Trump whisperer, someone who can bring him around when that is a requirement. She was very tough on the issue of security guarantees that work for the Europeans, not necessarily for Vladimir Putin, because, of course, over the weekend, the White House was indicating that had a breakthrough and that Vladimir Putin had agreed to something pertaining to security guarantees. The Europeans don't trust that, and they want real detail from Donald Trump about what that's going to look like. It sounded possible today as though Trump is preparing to announce some sort of US military commitment, whether serving as a backstop or more than that, for those security guarantees that the Europeans primarily will, of course, be providing.
So that and, of course, land concessions, how important is that in this particular deal?
Well, it was interesting that Volodymyr Zelenskyy indicated that at one point President Trump had got some maps out, and they were at one stage today seemingly poring over a map. President Zelenskyy said it was a great map, and he was wondering if he could take one of them back to Kiev with him, and Donald Trump said he'd find a way of getting him one. I mean, from Zelenskyy's perspective, I think the Ukrainians understand that there will have to be some sort of ceding of some kind of territory, but they're absolutely not willing to go as far as Vladimir Putin and possibly Donald Trump want them to go. It's also important to underscore that when Donald Trump talks about land swaps, it's not at all clear what Russia is going to be swapping here. I mean, the Ukrainians are being asked to give up terrain, but Russia doesn't really have any terrain to give up unless you're talking about a return of Crimea, and there's no indication that that is what is being countenanced. So there is suspicion on the part of the Ukrainian president and European leaders about that as well. I think the overriding point to make, Tubbo, is that President Trump again today still seems to be a man who thinks that you can resolve all of this with a snap of a fingers. It can all be done very quickly. He was sort of musing about how he was surprised that this was proving so complicated to resolve. The reality is, once you get the maps out, it's a little bit like the conflict in the Middle East. Once you get maps out and you start poring over maps, this gets really complicated, and complexity is going to take a lot more time than a very impatient president of the United States seems to understand.
The German Chancellor saying put pressure on the Russian President Vladimir Putin for a ceasefire. Do you think walking out of this meeting, Donald Trump will be picking up the phone and putting pressure on Putin for a ceasefire?
Well, there is going to be a phone call. We know that at the end of the day, Donald Trump is planning to call Vladimir Putin and brief him about his meetings today, and spoke about the possibility of brokering that three-way meeting that would include Putin, Zelenskyy, and the US, possibly represented by Donald Trump himself. On the ceasefire issue, President Trump has done a complete 180 since last week. Last week, he said that if he emerged from his summit meeting with Vladimir Putin without a Russian commitment to a ceasefire, there would be very severe consequences for Moscow, by which he meant a new set of sanctions. He's totally abandoned that. He now says he doesn't believe in ceasefires, and he claims that he has solved 6 wars since he returned to the White House, all of them without ceasefires. That's a completely false claim. If you look at what President Trump claims to have brokered between India and Pakistan a few weeks ago, that wasn't the resolution to a war. It was the brokering of a ceasefire. And the Indians, by the way, say he didn't broker it. If you look at what he brokered between Cambodia and Thailand, that wasn't the end to a war. It was a ceasefire about a month ago. And in that case, the Malaysians say that they brokered it, not the Americans. So this idea that Donald Trump is claiming that he has solved wars without ceasefires and that you can just negotiate the end to a conflict even while the fighting is taking place. Another Russian bombardment of Ukraine last night that, as Volodymyr Zelenskyy, you heard him there earlier, said, killed civilians, including an 18-month-old child. The Europeans clearly, and the Ukrainians, are pushing back on that and saying it's flat wrong. And yet President Trump keeps going to this idea that he's already done it and therefore he can do it again, even though actually, in reality, he's never done it.
Simon Marks, let's leave it there. Much appreciated. Thanks for coming on this evening. That's our U.S. correspondent in Washington, D.C., Simon Marks.